good to have you join us today on this edition of Business Daily. I'm Lee Ji-yoon in Seoul. Let's first get a quick check of the day's highlights. The government's tougher lending requirements to bring Korea's massive household debt under control have actually caused some negative side effects. The upcoming U.S. presidential election in November could signal a change in U.S. policy on global free trade, which could in turn also affect the Korean economy and its exports. We'll sit down with an expert to talk about this. Korea's export prices fell for 2 months in a row in April due to the stronger local currency. What's notable, though, is that levels retreated to the lowest in over 3 decades. Our Park Jong-hong starts us off.
The drop in export prices is largely blamed on the strength of the Korean currency against the U.S. dollar. In April, the U.S. greenback traded at 1,147.5 won on average. This reflects an increase of 3.4% from the previous month, when a dollar was worth 1,188 won. As a result, this led to an overall slide in export prices. According to preliminary data from the Bank of Korea, the export price index came to 78.19 last month, down 3.4% from a revised 80.97 the previous month. What's more, it marks the lowest level since 1985. The price index represents changes in the value of Korean exports in terms of local currency, meaning the higher the index, the more lucrative the business. In terms of export items, outbound prices of agricultural and fishery products slipped 0.9% on month in April, which was the smallest decline. At the other end of the spectrum were DRAM semiconductors, tumbling as much as 10.8%. Import prices also suffered a setback due to the won's appreciation. They slipped 1.9% in April from the previous month. Park Jong-hong, Business Daily.
Earlier this year, the Korean government laid out measures to slow down the explosive pace of mortgage lending in the country. And while they have proven relatively successful in curbing lending at Korea's biggest banks, we're now starting to see some negative effects from those measures. Our Shin Se-min reports.
The government's introduction of tougher lending requirements was meant to control Korea's mounting household debt, but it has sparked some issues of its own. In February, the Financial Services Commission stepped in, ordering commercial banks to start screening mortgage applicants more carefully. Under the Commission's mandatory guidelines, banks are required to base their decision on a household's ability to repay the principal and the interest together. Before, banks had extended handsome grace periods to help applicants push back the payment burden. The move came as Korea's household debt reached an all-time high of $1.02 trillion in February, growing $104 billion in the space of a year. The Bank of Korea says the pace of mortgage loan growth from commercial banks slowed by $1.6 billion in the first 3 months of the year compared to the same period last year. But loans taken from secondary financial institutions, where interest rates are generally much higher, hit $217 billion as of February, the highest figure tallied since the central bank started collecting related data in 2003. It's not a healthy trend, according to market watchers.
Most of the loans taken out from secondary and tertiary financial institutions are by borrowers that are more vulnerable in their financial standing. This will in turn become a much heavier burden on them should the key interest rate surge in the future.
On top of that, the property market, which got a boost from government-led monetary stimulus measures, appears to be in a downturn. In its latest report, Korea Development Institute said the 26% on-year drop in home transactions in the first quarter comes in well below a 5-year average. Experts say purchasing sentiment was dragged down by the new lending guidelines. Shin Se-min, Business Daily.
And it's not just household debt that has surpassed the 1,200 trillion won mark. There are concerns that government debt could soon snowball to the same level when we consider the debt held by the Bank of Korea. Our Eunice Kim explains.
As of this week, Korea's sovereign debt has exceeded 613 trillion won. It's a significant increase from the 590 trillion won clocked in at the end of last year. By March, it was at 609 trillion to reach 613 trillion won this Tuesday. But this figure does not include debt held by Korea's central bank. To the 613 trillion won figure, add the 477 trillion won held by the Bank of Korea. You get a number that nearly hits 1,100 trillion won, or $935 billion. At a trend as fast as this, the combined government and BOK debt could soon climb to somewhere beyond 1,200 trillion won. The reason why the Bank of Korea's debt is not included in the government debt tally is because it is not classified as a public institution, unlike some central banks in Europe that are. Some say BOK debt could very well be categorized as national debt, well reflected in the controversy 2 years ago on whether mounting monetary stabilization bonds issued by the central bank should be included in the public sector debt estimation. Experts are concerned if the debt carried by the BOK bloats too much, it could affect monetary policy. For instance, if it needs to pay out interest at a time when monetary tightening needs to come into play. Under the current low rate of 1.5%, the BOK's yearly interest burden is 7.15 trillion won, or about $6 billion. When the time comes to raise the benchmark, the interest payout could get heavier, not only for the central bank, but the national economy as a whole. Eunice Kim, Business Daily.
Thanks to Korean researchers who have succeeded in breeding 6 domestic varieties of Calla lilies, which had long been imported, consumers are now able to get these late spring bloomers for a cheaper price. Our Lee Joo-young has more.
A symbol of holiness, faith, and purity, these flowers called Calla lilies are popular for weddings, funerals, and hotel decorations. And along with growing demand for these elegant blossoms comes good news from the Gangwon-do Agricultural Research and Extension Services that they have succeeded in breeding 6 domestic varieties as of 2015. Up until now, farmers have been struggling to balance the needs in the market.
It's hard to manage the profitability. The lead reason being the production costs are high because it's a pricey foreign species.
But having homegrown late spring bloomers now means the expensive foreign royalty of about $4 per bulb has been slashed, bringing production costs down to only $2. The cultivation area for these native southern African flowers has been expanding in Gangwon-do province in particular. What was only 1 hectare back in 2010 has now increased to 4 hectares as of 2014. This is about 33% of the total cultivation area of these cone-lined flowers nationwide. The state-run Agricultural Research Institute says this new development can generate an economic effect in imports equivalent to at least $1 million and adds it will work to increase the cultivation area of Calla lilies to 10 hectares by 2018. Lee Joo-young, Business Daily.
With less than 6 months to go until Americans head to the polls to elect their new president, the race is shaping up to be a battle between Republican Donald Trump and Democrat Hillary Clinton. And today we take a look at what each of their economic policies would look like if they're elected and what kind of impact they would have on the Korean economy.
No one can be sure who'll come out the winner on November 8th. But according to a Reuters Ipsos poll released on Wednesday, the U.S. Republican presumptive nominee Donald Trump is now in a statistical tie with the all-but confirmed Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton in the general election matchup. Analysts say the new poll signals that the presidential election might be more hotly contested than expected. And Seoul has its eyes on the race as well, because depending on who wins in the U.S., Korea's economy could be affected by a new set of economic policies. Compared to incumbent President Barack Obama, the two candidates have a stronger Americans First stance. Trump has been advocating protectionist trade practices and proposing steep tariffs on Chinese and Mexican imports as a way to bring jobs back from overseas. Clinton, on the other hand, has promised good jobs for Americans and higher wages, while speaking against the outsourcing of local jobs. So with the big day fast approaching, how can Korea get ready for a new U.S. leader and the potential changes that will follow?
And to tell us more about where the country's economic policies are headed, we have Professor Kim Se-won from Ewha Women's University joining us in the studio today. So good to see you, Professor.
Pleasure to be here.
All right, so now taking into account the close relationship between Korea and the U.S., I think it's fair for us to say that the U.S. presidential election will have quite an influence on Korea's economy as well as diplomacy. So can you give us some examples from the past U.S. presidential elections?
Well, in economic relation between U.S. and Korea, the most important part is the trade between the two countries. And Korea has benefited a lot actually in the past by having U.S. as a major export partner. So in this respect, U.S. government's trade policy affected Korean economy in many different ways. So relatively speaking, between Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, Korea's export to U.S. has a higher growth rate under Republican presidents.
All right, so you're saying that it's not so much about who is elected as president, but which party wins the election when it comes to assessing the impact on the Korean economy.
Exactly. The two different parties has different style of the economic policy. For the case of the Democratic presidents, they more focus on investment in infrastructures like education and highways. And they are more protective of domestic manufacturers like IBM and Ford. And on the other side, the Republican presidents are more inclined to increase the domestic consumption and investment. So that naturally increases import of the United States, and that had a positive effects on Korean export to United States.
All right, now the two candidates, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, differ in many election pledges, but we can't deny the fact that they both hold stronger protectionist stance compared to the current Obama administration when it comes to global trade. So what are some differences between their economic and trade policies?
Well, I think the both presidential candidates share the theme of the trade policy, which is more protective than that of the Obama administration. But in details, they are slightly different. Hillary Clinton doesn't want to sign on TPP agreements, and she is more restrictive on currency manipulators. Donald Trump, and he is more protective to domestic producers, and he wants to impose more tariffs on imported goods.
All right. Well, what about those free trade agreements that the U.S. has in place with other countries, including Korea? Because Trump has actually said that he would break or renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, if he becomes president, which means we can't be too sure about the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, right?
Well, there is a famous word about the international trade that says no country has been hurt in human history by increasing international trade. So I believe that two candidates' anti-free trade remarks are kind of a political slogan. So as soon as one of the two becomes the president of the United States, he or she will see the value of the free trade, which is fundamental part of the U.S. Economy's prosperity.
So not so much worries about the FTAs in place right now.
Exactly.
All right. Well, the two candidates are also against, like you said, the multi-trade pacts like the Trans-Pacific Partnership or TPP deal. And experts are actually saying that Korea could benefit from this. Why?
Well, actually, there are two competing multilateral free trade framework, TPP and RCEP. And we have seen that Korea is more involved in RCEP along with China. So if U.S. does not go for TPP, there is a possibility that RCEP will dominate free trade protocol in Asian region.
All right. Well, now at this point, we were wondering, how have the markets reacted to U.S. presidential primaries as well as some of the poll results that have come out so far?
Well, actually, Donald Trump's tough remarks on foreign policy really affected Korean and Japanese stock markets at the beginning of the presidential race. But that has been almost fully reflected these days. So he did additional remarks, tough remarks on foreign policies does not affect the Korean stock market at all.
But then looking ahead, what kind of changes can we expect in the Korean stock market in the run-up to the November presidential election?
Well, as time goes by, as the election day comes close, I think both of the presidential candidates will intensify the degree of the toughness on foreign policy. So in that case, there is another possibility that Korean stock market is affected by these remarks.
Another thing to keep an eye on is Korea being recently put on a monitoring list by the U.S. for currency manipulation. How would things look on that front from here on out?
Well, even though U.S. government put Korea at a watching list about the currency manipulation, there's no concrete punishment about it. That means it is kind of diplomatic warnings only. So since both of the Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are pretty restrictive on currency manipulating countries, there is a high possibility that U.S. government in the future to carry out a concrete punishment on these countries.
All right. Thank you so much for your insight today, Professor.
Thank you very much.
And that wraps it up for today, but we'll be back tomorrow with more business news that matters to you. So don't forget to tune in then. Thanks for watching and goodbye.